and learned, and then for 30 years taught existential therapy, came out of the tradition of Jim Bugental, who observed that there's two basic existential postulates. Now, these echo two basic Buddhist insights, which we'll get to. But the existential therapy postulates, the first, is that we're all endowed with an inner guidance system, an inner compass, what he called an existential sense. And the second postulate is that we're in some way blocked from sourcing ourselves from that sense. So the work of therapy has nothing to do with the first. There's no way to improve upon the inner guidance of what can be considered our small wee voice inside. But it has everything to do with how we're in some measure blocked or obscuring our access to our inner guidance. And so the way we understand that in Northern California is any sort of resistance to the free and open flow of awareness. That would be the inner sense. And when that's flowing and when we're in touch, nothing needs to be changed. The work comes in when we're resisting that or in some way interrupting it. So these two existential postulates, taken to a higher octave or focused on more essentially, reveal also the two basic Buddhist insights, the key insights the Buddha came up with. The first is that we have an innate intelligence, or true nature. This is an unfabricated presence, inherently free, inherently unfettered as a flow of experience, which is, of course, the same thing as a flow of awareness. So this is what we refer to in the sense of authentic presence. It's this free, open, uninhibited, non-compulsive, unfettered flow of awareness, complete and free as it is. So there's no mediation involved. There's no management involved. There's no calculating. So this is the primary, the big insight of the Buddhas, is that this, our true nature is inherently good, free, and true in the sense that an arrow flies true. And the second postulate or insight is that we've lost touch with our inherent nature, our innate intelligence, our natural well-being. The way that it's talked about in Buddhism is that we're ignorant of it. There's an ignorance to our nature. Now, this ignorance doesn't mean we're illiterate, doesn't have to do with being uneducated in some way, but it has to do with not being aware. So this might be an even better translation of this Sanskrit word moha that gets translated as ignorance, is really lack of awareness, being in a diminished capacity. So for our interests as psychologists, we might want to just spend a moment and consider how this works psychologically. And this is where Buddhist psychology is quite insightful in talking about our diminished capacity as a form of divided consciousness, which is a bit paradoxical. With the arising of self-consciousness comes the arising of unconsciousness. They go together. In fact, we might want to just pause here and think about how that even happens in terms of human development, particularly child development. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, as you may know, was very interested in early child development earlier in his career. And he spoke to a phase of human development called the mirror stage. It doesn't get taught a whole lot anymore. Jacques Lacan was informed by this and applied it to some effect in his psychoanalysis. But what the mirror stage displays is that somewhere around the second year of life, something happens to a human being that doesn't happen with other primates, at least not in the same way. And that's this development of self-consciousness. So you might be interested that the research that this is based on is comparative research between humans and primates. And for instance, an experiment was set up, which Merleau-Ponty reports on, where there would be an area like a stage where there would be a mirror. And up until about the age of 18 months, a chimpanzee and a human infant will respond the same way to a mirror. They'll see an image in the mirror and they'll approach it. But then when there's no body there, they'll look behind the mirror to see what is that chimp or baby-like image in the mirror. And when they see there's nothing behind the mirror, they lose interest in that mirror image and go off and do something else. The baby will probably put something in its mouth, right? Something more interesting to it. But somewhere around the age of 18 months, there's a divergence that happens for human beings. And around that stage, the baby will approach the mirror as before, but instead of losing interest or looking behind the mirror for the body, the baby gets fascinated with its image in the mirror, recognizing itself. And you see this in games of peekaboo and hide and seek. There's a lot of this sort of play that happens with toddlers that they just love. It's just absolutely jubilant about. And the idea about this is that prior to this point, a human being there's a specific prematurity of birth, meaning that after the baby's born, its awareness exceeds its physical capacity. So where other animals, like a horse, for instance, will be born and it'll flop out of there, but then fairly soon it will stand up. And other animals too, kittens and puppies, maybe take a little bit longer, but it's like no big deal. Eventually, they'll be awkward and figure out their way in the world. But the idea is with human beings, it's different. Because at some point, the baby has, first of all, a long time before it can walk or talk, but it's aware that the other human beings can do these things. They're in language, they can motor around, they can do what they want, and the baby can't. So the theory here is that the human infant exists at first in a state of fragmentation or incapacity, and to this extent suffers the sense of incompleteness or incapacity. But at the point of recognizing its image in the mirror, all that changes because the image in the mirror is completely perfect. It obeys everything the baby does. Move your hand, the image moves its hand. And so there's an idealization of me that I see out there in the mirror. So self-identity begins as a break or as a division within consciousness. A split happens. And so I am that. And that is just perfect. Does everything I want. Gives me a sense of self-control, self-mastery. We should say really the illusion of self-control and self-mastery. And so this is, I find, incredibly fascinating. And as far as I'm aware, it's the most sophisticated understanding of the psychological impact of self-consciousness anywhere in the East or West. That our identity takes place vis-a-vis a reflection. I am that. That great line from the poet Rimbaud, right? I is an other. Captures exactly this phenomena. And it's not really, of course, that the baby thinks it's in the mirror. It's not like that. But it sees itself through its reflection. We see ourselves through a projection. And so through this self-consciousness now, everything gets developed on this basis, where self is divided from other, object from subject, and conscious from unconscious. And there's a gap that forms. Somehow there's an in-betweenness to who I am and how I then experience everything else. And so that begins a lifelong process of self-grounding through consciousness. So this primal break, which it seems to me, if you're aware a little bit of psychoanalytic thought, there's the idea Freud had of a primal repression. This is it. He said, on the basis of this primal repression, then all the other repressions take place. This split is that. We're no longer, our center is no longer inside our body. There's a break from the ground of being into a self-grounding project. Self-identity. And so along with this break, there's the felt sense also that something's missing. Even though we overcome, the baby overcomes a kind of sense of inadequacy, it doesn't really solve the problem. In fact, in a way, it only exaggerates the problem. That there's a sense to us, and now we're shifting into Buddhist psychology, that something's missing. Something's lacking about the way we are in the world. we're in some way left wanting. Now, this is another pivotal construct in Buddhism. The motivator of samsara is often translated as desire, but perhaps a better word is wanting. There's some way that we're lacking. And we spend our life trying to fill that, trying to satisfy the sense that back of everything, something is wrong with me. Something somehow is wrong with me. This discontent is one of the three key basic Buddhist existential givens. There's three of them. And this is the famous first one of suffering, dukkha, or the sense of a pervasive discontent that is never completely quelled. It keeps niggling. Need something more, just a little more. This is suffering in the sense that we're in a certain way, conflict or tension with our existence as it is. We want a little more of good stuff and a little less of the bad stuff. And so it goes. So there's striving for things that make us feel better and more complete, and then trying to get rid of those things that don't. So this is a kind of basic motivator. Or we could say perpetual discontent. Now, this is the bad side. But the other side of this coin is that we, in some sense, know it. There is this inner sense that feels, somehow knows, something's wrong. Something's not quite right. So this is where the discontent, our niggling, is a tendril of intelligence, a tendril of innate intelligence, that if we heed it, we can then open up. What is it that's missing? Rather than simply go on compulsively, chasing after whatever the latest project is, relationship, accomplishment, things that will kind of make our life complete. As I think Elvis Presley had a line, something, the tender, true, make my life complete, sweetheart. Something like this. We keep looking for our completion outside. This is really the mind's project in general, which gets elaborated, reified, in a sort of compulsive way. We ground ourselves and reify ourselves according to a story of me. It becomes the theme of our life that we want to promote and we want to defend, the story of me. We'll seek praise, recognition, pleasure, fame, and we'll try to avoid blame, criticism, pain. But of course, in order to be sensitive enough to feel pleasure and pride, we have to also be sensitive enough to feel pain and humiliation. Right? We can't have one without the other. And so it turns out that all our efforts to ground ourselves, to make ourselves feel complete, nothing works. Nothing really works. Things work for a short while. I get the new iPhone, new relationship, make some money. But then the niggling isn't satisfied, is it? There's still a sense that we need to do something more. Still a kind of a hole in our soul, is said sometimes. So recognizing that nothing we do works is a kind of existential sobriety. And it's a real strength in general of existential therapy that what we do have is the freedom to choose. So we can be resolute, we can stop whining, we can stop fantasizing and get real. Right? So this is, so valuable in terms of so many forms of psychotherapy. And so we can choose what we want, and so then we can respond to our predicament rather than be at the mercy of our reactions, emotional reactions, knee-jerk reactions, or projections, and so forth. We can decide how we're going to go forward, what we're going to want, what we're going to not want. So this accepting of responsibility for our predicament is a form of actualizing our existential freedom. That we're not simply a victim of circumstances, not to be simply content with being a victim of circumstances, but to choose how we're going to relate and how we're going to go forward. So I guess the epitome of this is a statement something on the order of, this is where I stand. And I'm willing to pay the price for making my choices. Going for what I want, it will be blocked or challenged by the world in various ways. I accept that responsibility. I accept that price for my freedom. This is really quite huge. It's the courage to be ourselves rather than someone else. Heidegger was very instructive on this point. He's talking about das Man and the they, and how we can become a they self rather than ourself. And it echoes that great line from the poet Antonio Machado, right? That what the soul prefers is that you fail at living your own life rather than succeed at living somebody else's. So this victory of daring to do that and being willing to take the pain and pay the price is what we mean by psychological authenticity. rather than pretending, being dominated by shoulds and should nots that come from the outside. We source ourselves from within. We own what we love, and we own what we hate. And we pay the price. We suffer that willingly. This is authenticity. It's psychological authenticity as an expression of existential freedom. Existential freedom is a freedom of doing, of willing. I stand here, not there. This way we can be true to our desires, authentic in that sense. Be true to our desires and aversions. And so in this way we can realize the goal of depth psychology, of, as Freud put it, of psychoanalysis, right? Of transforming neurosis into a normal unhappiness. Transforming neurosis into normal unhappiness, which is essentially this sobriety where we take responsibility. Non-reactive, we respond, and we accept the consequences of that. Of course, we're not out of the woods yet, because underneath that, there's still the old niggler, the basic separation, the price that we have to pay for being self-conscious to begin with. Now, existential, most psychology in general really doesn't pay a lot of attention to this deeper break inside, this more subtle and pervasive discontent. But still, there's so much to be learned and appreciated from this level of existential freedom and psychological authenticity. Not the least of which is realizing that authenticity isn't about a substance or a state or a self. Understood accurately, there's no such thing as an authentic self. There's no such thing as an authentic state. What there is an attunement to the inner sense, right? Because our inner sense changes depending on our circumstance, depending on our context, and depending on our own evolution. What we thought was true when we were younger maybe isn't so true anymore to us. We've grown, we've learned more. And so we change our mind. So this primacy of presence, right? That's another way of talking about our inner compass, our inner sense, is respecting that there's a primacy of process, a primacy of presence, not of states or structures like a self structure or a personality structure, all of these sort of reified entities that psychology proposes is the subject matter of psychology. Self, individual, all of these nominative entities really miss it. Somebody, I can't remember right now, this lovely quote, it was a psychologist who opined that structure, in the sense of personality, structure is the secretion of process. This was a very clear insight into what's really going on. Not fixed. It's fixed only in our mind. In our consciousness is it fixed. And then, of course, we'll cling to our opinion about things. And we know how that goes, don't we? It just creates conflicts. But again, accepting responsibility for our differences has integrity. Paying the price, realizing, okay, maybe with somebody we have, an irreconcilable difference. Okay, dang. That's the way it is. And we take the hit. So once again, psychological authenticity has a lot of dignity and integrity to it, and is not to be minimized. It's one of the dangers about spiritual orientations in general. We don't want to do any bypassing. But first, we've got to earn it. And my feeling, and this is my opinion, is that we have to earn it psychologically through facing what we really want and what we really don't want. And then, of course, the next step is realizing that there's no escape, that nothing really works. We never really get to where we want to get to. We never really get to the sense of being complete and being beyond discontent. But going through, particularly in an existential way, going through this understanding that true self, there's no true self, there's no authentic self or state, really opens an incredibly fertile door. This acceptance that we have to keep choosing. It's not enough to just one time choose, this is where I stand, or this is what I want. Circumstances change and we have to keep choosing over and over again, interminably. And this, more or less, is kind of the height of psychology. It'll go that far. Or maybe transpersonal, will animate a little bit farther. But I think in terms of existential work, really this is what most of it comes down to. And being sober, being realistic, being sober, taking the pain, and doing our best not to close our heart around it all. This would be a fabulous outcome for most psychotherapies, where you decide you're not going to close your heart, you're not going to play it safe, you've been wounded maybe in love. So you think, I don't want to risk that again. But then something in you, whether it's hormonal or it's something deeper than that, right? And so deeper than hormonal would be this sense of wanting to feel complete. And of course, being in a love relationship is one of the great things. It gets us very close. And sometimes it even briefly pulls it off. You just think, I couldn't get any better, right? This is it. But then, of course, time passes. And then realize that really wasn't it either. So accepting that there's no end, there's no way we can stop and disengage, make a good choice, exercise our freedom, our existential freedom. We have to keep doing it over and over and over again. Keep attuning to the inner sense. This recognition, the implications of this is something that existential and psychology in particular, for sure, hasn't really taken fully to heart. It's not really that Buddhism says anything radically different. It just says the same thing in greater depth. So the thing to take to heart is that there's no self, no real self, no absolutely true self, no self entity that endures. So this is a second or the third of the existential givens, just as to review, right? The three primary existential givens of Buddhism are suffering, discontent, impermanence, right? Which is obvious, isn't it? We're all getting older. Everything, nothing to be relied on. Everything changes. Even a situation where we gain prestige, for instance, and we get praised, well, that can be good for a run, but then things change. Maybe somebody else gets more important. They get more likes on Facebook, or however it is we're tallying this feedback loop, right, where I'm okay, against the sense that I'm not really. Something's off on a basic level with me. Things are impermanent, so we can't count on anything. Intellectually, we know that, but it's amazing that the capacity of a kind of human ignorance to really forget that we're going to be dying, and who knows when that's going to come. We think, oh, it's many years off, but of course we don't know that that's true. So this second given of impermanence, suffering, impermanence, and then the third, which is the really disturbing one. Suffering wasn't bad enough, and then there was impermanence. We're going to lose everything. That's not bad enough. Then the fact that, I don't exist as I think I do. There's no self. This is the third. So this is what Buddhism, in fact, does take to heart. It is really the linchpin that allows for awakening. So beyond psychological authenticity, that is an existential freedom of doing, lies a radical authenticity, or we could say ontological authenticity. That's the essential freedom of being, untethered to any self-ground. This openness, often getting translated as emptiness. Really, the truth of our situation is groundlessness. This is the more difficult understanding, and it's the key understanding that really allows us to collapse the inner split we have inside, where we're pushing things away or trying to hang on to things, and we just stop micromanaging and let the whole thing drop. Beyond psychology is openness as such, being as such, experience as it is, letting what is be as it is. This is authentic presence. Heidegger would say, letting beings be the beings they are. It's not that this the understanding of open emptiness is exclusive to Buddhism, of course. It's there in existential philosophy. It's right there. Heidegger in particular, Buber as well, but Heidegger in particular unpacked this, the whole notion of Dasein, right? To get away from this reified notion of selves, which is sneaky, because if we, as a therapist, if we start thinking of the other person as an entity, then it shifts our thinking in a more what can be done about it sort of a way. It's not a letting be way. It doesn't encourage a letting be way. It encourages like how to fix what's broken. How to get somebody to stop behaving badly. Be who they are, right? So it becomes very important to shift from this notion of entities, of self-centeredness, to this notion of being present, which is, of course, what Dasein really means. Their being present, being open, being the being you are. Being as you are is probably more to the point. This is our true nature. Buddha nature. The innate well-being of existence as such, which, for the most part, we're out of touch with. Separate from. Caught in our own bubbles, our own thought bubbles, our concept bubbles. That's, experientially speaking, that's the thing. And this is what becomes very obvious when we sit down to meditate. The mind is somewhere else. Eckhart Tolle speaks of compulsive thinking. This is the problem. That we're proliferating a fantasy. We're proliferating imaginations and acting through them. So we live in a world of projections without knowing that we're the one doing the projecting, that it's our own mind that's doing the projecting. Lost in what we see, as if what we see is actually out there in a solid way, rather than filtered through our vision, through a vision that is tilted and shaping what it is we see in order to help us feel secure and whole, rather than fragmented and incomplete. You know, Winnicott understood a lot about this. Right? The psychoanalyst Winnicott, he talked about transitional phenomena, transitional space, transitional objects. The baby has that little blankie, right? Or the stuffed animal as their little transitional object. And so normally people think, oh, when that's over, then the baby's now okay. is over the transition. No, not over the transition. Winnicott understood this completely because the stuffed animal moves into language, and language becomes the transitional space. And we never make it across. We're always in transition, which is a kind of a psychological way of talking about impermanence. We're never across, and there's a way it's very hard to stop trying to get across, trying to get somewhere better than where we are. This is the striving, grasping, compulsive thinking, in which we're in some sense there rather than here. So whether it's in therapy or in meditation, they're very different, of course. On the one hand, you're sitting on a cushion alone. On the other hand, you're in a conversation and a relationship. But in either case, we want to get out of our own way, right? We want to stop proliferating a fabricated existence, a fabricated world, and living through our projections, relaxing that, coming home to our experience as it is, rather than how we think it is. And therein lies the art of therapy and the art of meditation as well. To relax the way we think we are, the way we think our experience is, and tune in to the way things actually are, without being filtered in various ways through these skillful means, meditation or therapy and such, where we cleanse the doors of our perception. So Heidegger also, Meister Eckhart understood this because it's clear to me that Heidegger had a clear glimpse or glimpses of unfabricated, unconstructed presence. He referred to these in the German as Augenblick, which he really got from Meister Eckhart, who first used it. It gets translated into the English as a moment of vision, meaning a glimpse of unconditioned presence, authentic presence. And Heidegger, like Meister Eckhart, felt like these are very rare and fleeting occasions. Blessed, like a thunderclap, strike of lightning. But we know through the Dharma, these can be cultivated. We can have another glimpse if we know how to position ourselves, to ready ourselves for it. The thing about the moment of vision is that it has nothing to do with our will. It has nothing to do with any sort of freedom of doing. You can't make it happen. What we can do is tilt the odds in our favor for letting it happen. We can, in various ways, open ourselves for a readiness to see. So there might be some things to talk about in what I've just said over the past hour. But maybe before we go into that, I'll also add that in Buddhism, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, and especially in Dzogchen, there's the understanding that there's three aspects to the path. There's the view, or what we would speak of in the West as theory. And then there's meditation, or what we would speak of as practice, praxis. And so all that we've been doing so far is about the view. It's having an idea of what's possible. And so this is where I feel like it's a great idea to consider the notion of authentic presence. That there is a relative truth. Everything is relative to everything. Nothing exists on its own. There is no self-entity. There's also no other entity. And I suspect that most of you are aware of the notion that nothing can be said to exist in itself because it's always on the process of becoming something else, right? Right? Like an apple starts as a blossom. It's not an apple yet, right? It's a blossom. Then it becomes, a green apple. Still don't want to eat it. Only when it becomes ripe is you say, oh, that's a good apple. But then, before we know it, it drops on the ground and begins to rot. Now it becomes something else. So this understanding of interdependence or of transitoriness is really essential to understanding the way things are rather than the way we'd like them to be. So thinking about the mind we have habit patterns, reaction patterns that we keep enacting in spite of ourselves. We know that we want to be happy. We know that we don't want to say the wrong thing. We know how we want to be. Nevertheless, we keep doing the same damn thing over and over again, repetitively. Not only doing the same damn thing, in terms of how the company that we keep when we're alone, the discontent in our own minds, the way we're not at ease with ourselves and the way things are, anxious, despairing, guilty. There are all these things that accompany us, which again, I want to underline this. These are tendrils of intelligence. These are wake-up calls, our anxieties, however they manifest. our depressions. If we know how to relate to them, then they become goads. They become messages from beyond to wake up. But it does take this second step from having more than a view to then having a way of making contact, a way of relating to our experience as it is. We want to have a practice to see through our projections because they're so darn compelling. It's very convincing that I exist. I have a memory of myself. But then you look back, you look at yourself, whatever, 20 years ago, it's a little hard to remember, like, why you were doing what you were doing. Who was that person? Sometimes we look back and we sort of marvel, was that me? And there's a connection, but it's weird. So then again, there's a sort of lucidity in that vertigo. Yes, but no. We couldn't say one way or the other. That inaugurates us into the mystery of being open. As long as we don't fixate and we learn how to stay open, now we have a practice, which whether in therapy or in contemplative practice, the key practices for both, for depth therapy, I would say, maybe not cognitive or behavioral therapy, but even that is changing. The key is not conceptual thinking, cognitive thinking, calculative thinking, again, as Heidegger helped clarify, is not that. It's meditative awareness. This is key for depth therapy as well as, of course, for contemplative attunement. Because that's what it's about, is tuning in, opening up, and dropping the fabricated separation of ourself, from our experience. So we know about this, we know that there are practices, and we can understand, felt sensing is important, focusing is important, a variety of experience near therapies which are developing, certainly in the United States and California, they're just sprouting like mushrooms in spring. All kinds of very fertile developments happening in terms of experience near work. But there's a third aspect that's also talked about in these higher dharmas, but it doesn't have to be limited to those. It's true for any Buddhism, really. You have your view, you have your practice or meditation, and then you have your integration or embodiment. Sometimes this gets translated as conduct or behavior. But what it really means is habituating to being open. So the practice is opening. The integration is being open on the fly. And in order to succeed, for instance, what Heidegger thought was possible, the occasional glimpse. Well, first of all, to have a glimpse is pretty darn good. If you can have a clear glimpse and you register it, that now will change your mind stream. According to Buddhist psychology, one glimpse, one clear glimpse, where you see the truth of no self, see the way things really are, which is usually absolutely ecstatic. A clear vision of that one time is enough to now to change the entire trajectory of your mind stream. And following that, if you have another glimpse, even better. Repeated glimpses, better still. All the way up to the point of something like a Buddha, where he was able to just rest in non-defensive presence through embodying openness, embodying authentic presence. So this third piece really is missing in psychology. So is there anything, Paula, you'd like to add before we close?
Yes, I'd like to say that just being feels so great. I wish I could do it 24 hours a day. Just being there, as we have done in your exercise. Yet it's so difficult, isn't it? To just get into that state.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. This whole way of going about it is, it's kind of like 2.5 dimensions, right? It's kind of like in Harry Potter, it's not 2-dimensional. It's not that much, but it's not 3-dimensional either, because I don't, we're not together in 3 dimensions. So we're in, like, what is it? It's like at the train station. We're in, platform, 2 1/3 here. And so I appreciate your sharing very much, because part of the challenge for me is tuning into everybody, and it's a bit different. It's a bit different.
We're getting used to it slowly. We're zooming around. So we're getting the hang of it, I think. So Ken, thank you very, very much. 2 hours just flew away. It was very intense and very interesting and inspiring. We look forward to tomorrow for the people who are going to join us again. And all I can say is have a good lunch for some of you and have a good dinner for some of the others.
Great. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.